Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, I so much appreciate the opportunity to focus on this crisis today with one caveat. I think it's a little disappointing to continue to stick to an inaccurate narrative that the fentanyl crisis in America is primarily an immigration problem. The fentanyl crisis in America is a health crisis. It is a public safety crisis. And as we've heard from testimonials today, it's a life and death crisis. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of fentanyl that is smuggled into the United States is brought in through legal ports of entry, mind you, not between ports of entry, but through legal ports of entry by primarily United States citizens. Don't just take my word for it. Look at CBP data. Now, I know it's been called into question earlier, the accuracy of it, even if it was off by, half. We're looking at half and half. Now, don't mistake my words here in condoning that anybody attempting to come into the United States unlawfully that happens to be carrying fentanyl should be off the hook. I disagree. We should clamp down on them. But if data is important for driving policy decisions and informing strategic actions, let's look at the facts. 80% plus of the fentanyl intercepted at the border is being brought in through ports of entry by United States citizens. So again, folks coming through unlawfully, I'm not saying ignore them, but let's not ignore where the concentration of the problem is. I won't ask the witnesses today what recommendations or strategies that we should be implementing through the Department of Justice, through the Department of Homeland Security. I think we're going to have opportunities for other DOJ officials in the coming days and weeks to do that, and we should. But I will suggest, colleagues, that the recent changes by the administration at the Department of Justice that has resulted in the shifting of critical resources, including from the FBI, including from the DEA, including the ATF, towards immigration enforcement, which, be clear, be honest with ourselves and the public, is not exclusive to violent criminals. It's everybody. Minor offenses, people who haven't committed any offense other than, in the eyes of folks, well, if they came illegally, then they're criminals. Horrible, horrible way to think about this. It's doing a disservice to our efforts to crack down on fentanyl crisis and other illicit drugs that are hurting and killing so many of our kids. My first question, Dr. Farfan Mendez, can you explain how diverting law enforcement resources towards immigration enforcement could actually undermine fentanyl investigations and make it harder to disrupt trafficking networks?
So the U.S. has a mechanism called the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. And this task force is made up of several agencies: Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Department of Labor, the U.S. Postal Service, and a number of others. State Department is also included there. Putting together criminal investigations that take down trafficking networks is a long process. It takes time, it takes interagency coordination. In the best of cases, it also takes international cooperation, including with Mexico. And so when you distract those resources and allocate them in another task, in this case, for instance, immigration enforcement, effectively what you're doing is undermining long-term efforts to try to precisely bring criminal groups to justice. And so there is, in the world that we have of limited resources, when you take away from one area, you will definitely impact another. And so there is definitely a concern of weakening these organized crime enforcement task force.
And it's okay if you don't know the answer to the following question, but in case you do, I understand that there's only one legal gun store in Mexico?
Correct. Mexico only has one legal gun store.
Okay, so for all of my colleagues who for years and years have talked about clamping down on the cartels, the criminal organizations that are arming themselves with weapons trafficked from the United States, folks, according to ATF data. Again, I'm not sorry for relying on our own data. Up to 500,000 U.S.-sourced firearms are trafficked into Mexico every year, with 70% of crime guns recovered in Mexico tracing back to the United States. Dr. Fafa Mendez, Mexican President Sheinbaum has stated that President Trump agreed to work on reducing the flow of guns into Mexico as part of yesterday's deal to delay the tariffs for a month. What concrete steps should the U.S. take to uphold that commitment?
And yes, ma'am, if you can keep your answer short, we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I hear this committee when you say that you want to save lives of American children and Americans in general. And what I say to you is the fentanyl market is not an isolated illicit market. It's very much linked to the firearms trafficking market. And so in that conversation that President Sheinbaum and President Trump had, I think for the U.S. to seriously address fentanyl, the conversation also has to be about how you prevent criminal groups to have the firepower that make addressing supply on the Mexican side incredibly difficult. As I say, these are shared tragedies both for Mexico and the U.S. And so if the crime is transnational, shouldn't the solution also be transnational?
Very well said. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I do want to address, before we move to our next senator, the argument that U.S. citizens bring the most fentanyl into the United States, not illegal immigrants. It has been pointed to today some incomplete seizure and arrest statistics that support that argument. So with the wide open border policies of the Biden-Harris administration over the last 4 years, we do not know the full scale of drugs smuggled into this nation. The prosecution statistics only account for individuals that were actually caught, prosecuted, and sentenced, not criminals who managed to actually evade detection. The Washington Post says that federal officials estimate that we're only catching about 5 to 10% of fentanyl that is coming in from Mexico. So do that math. If that's true, then we are only catching, or we're not catching 90 to 95% of the fentanyl that is actually coming across our southern border. We have to be honest about that. That should alarm every single one of us. And it also shows why border security is an important component to stopping the flow of fentanyl. Senator Kennedy.